expected after-tax returns. So stylised, what the Nordics did was to say, let's tax capital income at a low flat rate, perhaps the lowest marginal tax rate on labour, and then keep quite a progressive labour income tax rate. In Norway, for example, the capital tax rate, as Norman mentioned, is half the maximum labour tax rate. Now, it's harder to care about these issues if one has a very small government, or thinks, whether for economic or other reasons, that one should have a very small government. Low tax rates all round would provide the minimum distortion to investment, labour and consumption choices. And views are going to differ about the appropriate size of government. But it's fair to say, I think, that in the literature there's a lot more debate about the potential damage from a large size of government, crudely measured share of GDP, government spending, than there is about the distortionary effects of taxes on capital income. The OECD, for example, tends to be at the mushier centrist International Economic Agency. Its own research highlights the distortionary effects of corporate taxes. And after a long period in which they endorsed New Zealand's comprehensive approach to income tax, their 2007 survey, which focused on exactly the sort of scarcity of investment that I've highlighted here, suggested that New Zealand looks seriously at the Nordic option. So in advocating that New Zealand look to move to something like a Nordic system, I'm not taking a strong view on the size of government per se. If the size of government remains relatively large, then markedly shifting the focus of our tax system offers a way to help accelerate medium-term growth prospects. If eventually the consensus of opinion shifted in favour of much smaller government, there'd probably be some additional growth and income benefits. I suspect they'd be small, but that would allow labour tax rates to be cut in future. But in the next 10 to 20 years, with mounting pressures on government spending, I find it difficult to envisage New Zealand getting to a point where government is so small that we could be relaxed about treating capital and labour income the same for tax purposes, to getting to a point where, say, administrative simplicity considerations outweighed potential growth and allocative efficiency gains. Many, perhaps most, wouldn't want us to get to that point. So a Nordic tax system is partly about keeping to a minimum the inevitable damage to growth that big government does. And perhaps that's a reason why some, though not all, on the right wing have been reluctant to embrace it. Now, a Nordic tax system done seriously, and I mean something a lot further than 28%, would mean giving up considerable tax revenue. If pushed, my serious recommendation would probably be for a capital tax rate of, say, 12.5%. And a cut of that size has to be paid for. It might cost 3 to 4 percentage points of GDP and headline revenue losses. There's no point pretending there are free lunches on offer. We shouldn't spend the dynamic gains before we earn them either. Now, my focus isn't on precisely what package you put together to pay for this, but spending to GDP is still much higher than it was even in the middle of the last decade. There's still a fiscal deficit to close, of course. But materially reduced taxes on capital income probably means some combination of higher taxes on consumption. And that might well be appropriate given the windfall gains to owners of the wealth from cuts in capital taxes and on labour income. Tax wedges on labour are smaller in New Zealand than they are in many OECD countries. Our maximum marginal tax rate on labour is also relatively low. None of the old OECD countries has a higher rate. Although it mightn't raise much revenue and isn't my focus here, we could probably be open to favouring an inheritance tax over the taxation of lifetime capital income. In principle, a land tax could offer an attractive long-term option, or perhaps a now low tax on the net imputed rent on owner-occupied housing. So why not change? Well, some have argued that while the zero or low capital income tax might make good sense in a closed economy, New Zealand's in fact an open economy, and open in a particular way. The claims made that the New Zealand labour force is more than usually mobile. This was an assertion, for example, that the Tax Working Group report made, and I've argued many times with Norman, quoting the high number of New Zealand-born and educated people who are now living overseas, and the high number of foreign-born people living here. But what no one's yet done is to produce much evidence that labour flows into and out of New Zealand at the margin are materially more responsive to changes in income or consumption tax rates specifically than such flows are in other countries. I think the large stocks of New Zealanders abroad and of foreigners here probably tell us mostly about A, our fairly open immigration policy, and B, New Zealanders' responses to deteriorating overall living standards. It seems at least as plausible to me that to the extent that taxes influence migration, it's implicitly at least expected lifetime tax burdens and expected future after-tax income and consumption prospects that matter. Now, if labour were as mobile or as responsive to taxes as capital is, the argument for a dual tax system would be materially weakened. It would collapse, to be frank. But in general, the prices tell the story. Wage differentials across countries far exceed differences in interest rates and the cost of capital across countries. Capital is more mobile, more responsive to taxes than labour is. Others argue that a much lower capital or company tax rate would be a bad idea for New Zealand because of our existing reliance on foreign capital. First, of course, much of the foreign capital is debt, on which we already levy little or no tax because we know that we New Zealanders would be paying it, not the owners of the capital. Second, it's argued that if New Zealand lowers its company or capital tax rates, this will largely represent an unreciprocated gift to foreign tax systems. This point, as I understand it, shouldn't be overstated. Profits of foreign-owned New Zealand subsidiaries are typically taxed abroad only at the point where dividends are paid, and that's largely a discretionary choice, especially in a fast-growing economy with plenty of investment opportunities. Finally, some here have argued that capital income taxes on foreign investors are a way of capturing the value of location-specific rents in New Zealand. Personally, I've never been convinced of that argument, largely because the evidence that such rents are material is elusive at best. To the extent that they arise out of New Zealand's natural resources, to me the appropriate point to capture those rents, whether from New Zealand or foreign operators, is through royalties or other usage fees. Mostly I think we fool ourselves if we believe that we can have foreigners pay taxes to fund our public services. Some critics of a dual approach for New Zealand, and some modelling results I've seen, tend to focus on who writes the tax cheques rather than on who bears the economic burden of the taxes. Stage 1 economics, of course, told us they aren't the same and that the difference matters, although the difference can be hard to pin down. Just as costs to employers are payroll taxes or KiwiSaver levies will in the medium term almost wholly be borne by workers and lower than otherwise wages, so it's likely that a considerable chunk of capital taxes are borne not by the owners of capital but by wage earners, in the form of lower investment leading over time to wage levels in the whole economy being lower than otherwise. US studies have suggested that the overwhelming bulk of capital taxes will be borne by workers, even in a relatively more closed economy like that of the US. Shareholders don't seek pre-tax returns, but post-tax ones. To some extent, the sectors where the existing foreign investment's concentrated may matter to how we in New Zealand think about the issues we face if we were to adopt a Nordic system. If, for example, most of our foreign investment was in the farm sector, then lowering tax on farmers might provide a pure windfall to foreign investors. Final product prices, after all, are determined wholly in world markets. But that isn't New Zealand's situation. Only a small share of farmland is foreign-owned at present, and few of our other major tradables producers are foreign-owned. Indeed, Air New Zealand is one of our largest exporters. It's largely state-owned. The biggest single chunk of foreign investment in New Zealand actually appears to be in the financial sector. And it seems to me that if we were to markedly drop the tax rate on capital income, it's hard not to envisage an intensely competitive market narrowing intermediation spreads and other fees and charges to the benefit of the domestic economy as a whole. The potential dividends the foreign shareholders will be interested in won't have been materially affected one way or the other. The administrative challenges of a dual rate system are perhaps the most often cited objection. For large and listed companies, the challenges aren't particularly serious. It's relatively easy to distinguish capital from labour income. But there are real challenges that need to be faced for the self-employed and for closely held incorporated businesses, of which, of course, there are many in all countries, including New Zealand. For those firms, at least ones of any size, adopting a Nordic system would require some sort of rule-based assignment of income. A model used abroad, for example, has been to impute a return to capital based on assets held within the business and tax them as such, with the rest of the income assigned to labour. No doubt such an assignment rule could be complemented by some sort of minimum deemed labour income. Rules of that sort will always have an element of arbitrariness about them, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But equally, we shouldn't pretend that there are not material boundary issues in any conceivable real-world tax system. Managing and enforcing those sorts of boundaries in a Nordic system would keep the highly regarded and very capable people in IRD busy. We shouldn't multiply artificial boundaries where they're unnecessary. Doing so simply increases the costs of maintaining regulatory systems. But equally, we should be wary about prioritising administrative simplicity over economic substance when there are real behavioural differences. And given the scale of New Zealand's economic challenges, let's go back to that slide, we want a tax system that doesn't get in the way of entrepreneurship and investment, domestic and foreign, that's absolutely necessary to improving our fortunes. What could we expect to see from a wholehearted shift to a dual model? Well, I think we'd see materially higher investment, which in time will lift wage rates as well, particularly those for the least mobile and most vulnerable, because they're the ones with the fewest alternatives. Some economic opportunities which aren't viable, which can't generate the required after-tax rates of return under current tax rates, will be shifted into the viable column. That'll probably be most obvious in the lagging tradable sector of the economy, where New Zealand producers have little or no medium-term pricing power. For some activities, New Zealand will become a better place to base a business than it was hitherto. Now, I'm not suggesting New Zealand can become some sort of Antipodean Ireland, the good dimensions of Ireland, becoming a production hub for those vast markets on our doorstep. We don't have such markets. But if we have 1/5 of Ireland's success, a tax change of this sort would go a long way to setting us on the right track. But we shouldn't just focus on additional foreign investment. Getting on the road back to top-tier first-world incomes is likely to need them, the ideas, the technologies, the contacts, the markets, the savings they bring. But just as important, and perhaps more so in the long haul, is the creation of a culture that keeps out of the way of domestic entrepreneurs and the ideas, products and markets that they can generate. Global openness is an important part of our prosperity, but long-term sustained prosperity for New Zealanders is about the climate that we make. We'll also get a higher savings rate. Higher savings aren't a policy goal in their own right, but the current tax system bears inappropriately heavily on them. Some are sceptical about how strongly savings will respond, and I find it plausible that many middle-income householders, it might not change their behaviour very much. Empirical research, such as it is, tends to suggest as much. That might be because for many, savings is done with a retirement consumption goal in mind. For those people, the income effect of increased after-tax returns will reduce the need to save at a current income. For others, higher returns to saving will make deferring current consumption more attractive. New Zealand debates, though, seem to focus inordinately on household savings. And what I am fairly persuaded is that business savings as a percent of GDP would increase materially in response to lower capital income tax rates. Much investment self-funded through retained earnings and depreciation, and the level of investment would be likely to increase materially. Optimistic firms are more likely to borrow, but also to save and to retain more of their profits in the business. That's true whether they're New Zealand-owned ones or foreign ones. What about labour supply? Would labour supply fall? Well, of course, that depends partly on precisely how the cut in capital taxes was funded. There are ways in which government spending could be cut that would lower marginal tax rates for many or create income effects that encourage participation. I'm thinking of things around NZS, for example. Frankly, I'm fairly sceptical of how large any sustained deterrent effect on labour supply would be within reasonable ranges of changes in marginal tax rates. And we can come back to that if necessary in question time. But in the end, when one taxes something more heavily, one tends to get less of it. We should expect more capital. Capital is highly responsive to taxes, and a bit less labour. Labour is much less tax sensitive, and given the size of the state the New Zealand political process has chosen to adopt, we've probably been taxing labour too lightly. Just wrapping up, successful countries can afford all sorts of affectations and policy weaknesses, but we're not a successful country, at least relative to our expectations. I'm not arguing that the way we've taxed capital income was the major cause of our decline, but it is something that we can do an awful lot about to change. A shift to a dual tax model has its risks and uncertainties. All reforms do, but this is one we should adopt.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Michael. You didn't know Robin was in favour of lowering capital tax rates. I should say, for those of you who weren't at the first debate, that Joey at the front here wasn't being particularly impolite. We've asked him to make sure that both speakers get only 20 minutes, so that they've both got fair chance to present against each other. So he's ringing after 18, and then he's being impolitely ringing after 20. So Robin is going to oppose the motion that we should reduce our capital tax rates. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Norman. No slides. Well, I suppose I'll start with a common theme that on US politics, which Michael mentioned. Bill Clinton, in his recent speech to the Democratic Convention, contrasted ideological rant with real-world facts and realities. Well, I think you've heard the ideological rant now. So what I'm going to talk about is the real-world politics. I don't think, however, that Michael's right, that the Democrats think that Mitt Romney pays too much in tax, and maybe you'll sort of question some of his other comments on that basis. Anyway, now you're going to hear about the real world, and remember that I'm on the same side as Bill Clinton. And these days, everybody loves Bill Clinton. So remember that.